Because of him, you're no longer lost to your past. Because of him, you're no longer a slave to your shame. Because of him, you're no longer a prisoner to your pain. Because of him, you're no longer bound to your sin. Because of Jesus, we can actually take these things and lay them down at the foot of the cross. See, God's love has liberated us, you and me, free to forever walk in the light of his amazing grace.
Well, hello, McLean Church. We're coming to you from a bit different setting today as we launch a brand new series entitled Because. We are 3 weekends away from Easter as we record this talk today. And over the next few weeks, we'll be thinking much more intentionally and purposely about the events surrounding Easter, the events of Holy Week, Jesus' death, his burial, his resurrection. And most of us have a general idea of what those events are about. Most of us have a general understanding of the events surrounding Easter, like Palm Sunday and Good Friday. Um, but I think as we reflect on the events surrounding Easter and leading up to Easter, we have to admit a lot of our understanding of those realities is pretty limited. Um, when we think about Easter and we think about preparing for Easter, often we think about it in terms of what Jesus came to do to deal with humanity's sin problem. And certainly that is at the core or the center of the Easter message. But what we often fail to see is that in Jesus's work, his public ministry, the miracles he performed, his betrayal, his crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection, there's way more that's dealt with than just the problem of sin. There's way more that's dealt with and addressed than just the problem of sin and humanity's disconnection from God. Jesus, in his death, burial, and resurrection, and the events that lead up to those things, helps us see that in addressing the primal issue of sin, Jesus is really addressing and resolving so many more human realities or problems or predicaments that affect us in the everyday. So, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about because. What is the result of Jesus's work in the world? What is the outcome? What happened because Jesus was here? Because Jesus did the things he did. And in 4 talks, we're going to think about the fact of what the reality is because Jesus cared, what the reality is because Jesus came, what the reality we can experience is because Jesus died, and what reality is like because Jesus lives. So today, let's start by talking about the outcome or the consequence because Jesus cared. Word that's often associated with Easter is the word passion. Might think about the Mel Gibson movie now a number of years back, The Passion of the Christ, talking about the events in the final week of Jesus's life, which are often referred to as his passion. This idea comes to us from the Latin word passio, which means suffering. When we think of the passion of the Christ, we often think about Jesus's suffering. But passion means something else, especially in our present day English usage. Passion for us means something that we care deeply about, something that moves us toward action. And as one New Testament scholar has put it, Jesus's passion, the things he cared deeply about, led to his passion or his suffering. And today I want us to think about those things Jesus cared deeply about, using that idea of passion and a word that shows up repeatedly in the Gospels, a word formed from the word passion. It's the word compassion. Compassion. Remember, Jesus made the statement in Luke chapter 6, be compassionate as your Father in heaven is compassionate. And if you were here in our series, What Did Jesus Really Teach? We know that Jesus sort of rewrote the whole understanding of religion with that statement. And he helped us see religion as more about compassion than about a purity system. Jesus was motivated by compassion, and repeatedly in the Gospels, we find compassion being the element that drove him to do the things he did. In Matthew's Gospel in particular, we have four uses of this word describing different scenarios in which compassion motivated Jesus to act. And I want us to think about those four instances or those four scenarios, helping us understand better what it was that Jesus actually cared about because he cared. Uh, the first instance when we find this word in Matthew's gospel, and by the way, if you had the opportunity to be part of our recent Reading the New Testament class, you know that Matthew's gospel is probably the most Jewish of the four gospels, and Matthew sometimes is in love with his Jewish faith, and other times he's very challenging to his Jewish faith. And it seems perhaps that Jesus is particularly interested in showing Jesus's compassion, his ability to feel with, is what the word literally means. Jesus's compassion. Perhaps Matthew is interested in showing this as a challenge to the Jewish purity system of the first century, which wasn't real big on compassion. Jesus wants us to see Jesus, or Matthew wants us to see Jesus as a very compassionate individual. So, four times we have uh, incidences of Jesus being moved by compassion. The first is in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 37. There we read, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Jesus had compassion because the people he saw were like sheep without a shepherd. This is a powerful image, particularly in a first century agrarian culture, but we understand enough about sheep and shepherding to get the point. Jesus looked at the crowds he was engaging with. And again, we know from where Jesus lived, where Jesus traveled, we know from the descriptions of the people he hung out with. These are the lower classes of Judean society in the first century. These were people on the edge, lower socioeconomic status, people who were living on a subsistence um, type income or subsistence type experience. And Jesus sees them as sheep without a shepherd, uh, people who are being taken advantage of. They don't have the protection that a shepherd would afford. People who are being economically exploited. People who don't have any direction in life. People who don't have any reference point to give them perspective or direction in life. People who are just trying to get through every day without any larger sense of purpose or without any larger sense of hope. Now, we may be in a very different place than those peasants of the first century that Jesus saw and was moved with compassion toward. But our experience in many ways is the same. Um, Often we just face day after day with no bigger vision for our lives, day after day of just trying to get through, day after day of feeling like we lack any sense of divine guidance or divine protection in our life, just trying to survive, just trying to make it through. And when Jesus saw that in the people of his day, his heart was moved. His heart was moved with compassion because this is not the way we were meant to live. It's not the way people in Jesus' day were meant to live. It's not the way we're meant to live today. We're not to be like sheep without a shepherd. And when Jesus saw that human reality, he was moved with compassion to do something about it. Because Jesus cared, the people of his day and we today don't need to live lives that are like being sheep without a shepherd. And because Jesus cared, and because Jesus still cares, we have the resource in Jesus of a divine shepherd who can lead us, who can guide us, who can give our lives purpose and direction, who can provide us with the protection we need from the realities that can undo us. Because Jesus cared, we no longer have to just make it through day to day, just survive, just try to get by. Because Jesus cared, we could really live just like the sheep under the guidance and protection of a good shepherd are able to do. The second instance of Jesus' compassion comes shortly after this in Matthew chapter 14, when we read, when Jesus heard what had happened. Now, what Jesus has just heard about is the beheading of John the Baptist, his forerunner and his friend. When Jesus heard of his friend's death, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Jesus is human. He's grief stricken. He's heartbroken. He needs to get away. He needs to be by himself. But hearing of this, hearing of Jesus' withdrawal, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, what would you have done in this situation? You would have said, leave me alone, go away. I'm grieving. I need time to myself. But when Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them. and healed their sick. Repeatedly, we find Jesus miraculously healing people's physical ailments. Sometimes we get the notion that all Jesus was really concerned about was people's spiritual reality, their spiritual ailments, their spiritual diseases, their sin. But it's fascinating if you look at the accounts of Jesus' life and activity in the Gospels, more often Jesus is addressing people's physical needs, their physical suffering, than he is speaking specifically and exclusively to their spiritual reality. Jesus didn't separate the two. He saw humanity as a whole. He saw people as a unified being, spiritual, physical, all combined in this wonderful thing that is the human being. And Jesus' compassion extended to people's physical suffering. And he met the physical needs, particularly healing the physical ailments of many. Jesus cares about every dimension of our lives. He cares not just about those things that we try to exclusively isolate in the category of spiritual. Jesus cares about the fact that you're not feeling well today. And Jesus's response to many in his day and their physical ailments is to miraculously heal, to miraculously resolve the issue. For others, like Paul, as he will speak about later in his letters, Jesus transforms humanity's suffering into something that becomes meaningful and transformative in an individual's life. The point for our talk today is not what Jesus does specifically with our physical suffering. The point for our talk today is an acknowledgement that Jesus cares. Jesus cares about every dimension of our existence. And because Jesus cares, we have a source to take the reality of our suffering to. We're not left alone to try to manage, make sense of, or resolve our human suffering. We have a source to take that suffering to. Interestingly, a source, as we're going to see on Good Friday, that experienced our own physical suffering. Now I'm not left alone to deal with the pain and suffering of my life by myself because Jesus cared. I have a divine source to take that suffering to. Closely following Matthew chapter 15, Jesus called his disciples to him and says, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. This is the introduction to Matthew's account of the feeding of the 4,000. A chapter earlier, he's recorded Jesus' miraculous feeding of the 5,000. And here it's fascinating because Jesus is moved by, he cares about people's physical needs. In the previous passage, we saw Jesus caring about people's suffering. In this passage, we see about Jesus caring about, moved by compassion for people's physical needs. In this case, it was the practical need for something to eat, for food. But this really becomes an image of Jesus's concern for all of our physical needs. Um, in the first century, for the followers of Jesus in this particular passage, it was literally to have something to eat. In your case or our case, it might be having enough money to make the car payment or pay the rent or the mortgage, or having the resources to figure out how we're going to send our child to the college they want to attend. It may be a practical need like finding someone who can fix our driveway after a long winter. Practical, physical realities that create anxiousness and stress in our lives. They can be big things. How am I going to pay the mortgage? They can be little things. How am I going to find somebody to give me a ride to the doctor's appointment I need to go to next week? What this image or passage out of Matthew's gospel reveals to us is that Jesus cares about those physical realities, those physical needs that we experience every day and that are so often cause of so much stress. How will I do this? Should I do this or that? How will I have the resources to do this thing I need to do? Jesus taught his followers to pray that God would give us each day our daily bread. In the first century, daily bread, food, that was the embodiment of every physical need a person had. Jesus cares about every physical need we have, be it big or small, mundane or extreme. There's nothing beyond the scope of Jesus's caring for those physical concerns or needs we have in life, which means there's nothing too big or too small to talk to God through Jesus about. Because Jesus cared about people's physical well-being, we now have a divine resource to petition for our physical needs and well-being. And if, as again we saw Jesus taught in our previous series, that everything was spiritual, because there's a spiritual dimension underlying this physical reality. This divine resource in the person of Jesus beyond this physical reality has unlimited ability and resource to address, meet, and resolve the physical needs we have today. Because Jesus cared about things like our physical well-being, we no longer have to face the challenges, the dilemmas, the scarcity mentality that often follows our worry or our concern over physical needs. Instead, we can give those things to the God in the person of Jesus, who is moved by compassion when he saw people's physical need. Final passage, Matthew chapter 20. In this passage, Jesus encounters some individuals who are blind. And when he approaches them and asks them what they want him to do for them, they reply, Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 33, Lord, they answered, we want our sight and want to see. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. In Matthew's gospel, the restoration of sight to the blind really becomes a larger metaphor image of what Jesus was doing in his day and in his world. Yes, he was helping people practically see, in this case, uh, miraculously healing these blind individuals so that they could physically see again. But again, this act becomes a metaphor or image for what Jesus is really doing on a much larger scale with everyone. He's helping people really see life for all that it is, really see life for all that it embodies and entails, really see life from a larger perspective. We talked earlier that Jesus is very much concerned about our human suffering and our physical needs, but Jesus is also very concerned that we have a perspective on life, that we see life in a way that makes sense, in a way that works. Jesus provided people with an ultimate reference point, an ultimate place from which to view their lives in relationship with God, lived in connection with God, a way of viewing life that was no longer random or by chance, but was a life now with purpose and direction because they saw from a vantage point that began to make sense of life. Jesus restored sight to people, not just physically, but in a much broader way, as people were now enabled to see life for what it really is. We all have those days where we wonder what is it all about? Uh, oh, what am I doing here? What's the purpose of my existence? Jesus cared that people had that limited, that futile view of life and existence. And he showed us a new way, a new perspective, a new vision, life in connection with God, life in the kingdom of God, life about living out the ideals of God in the world. Jesus had compassion because people were blinded from seeing life in all its fullness, life from what it really was. Because Jesus cared about that human predicament, the inability to see life for what it truly is. Because he cared, he showed a different way. And now we have a model to follow, a model for life that helps us see life for what it truly is, in all its goodness, in all its joy, in all its beauty. Jesus certainly cared about the problem of sin. Jesus certainly cared about the human predicament of separation from God. But he cared about so much more. He cared about what could arguably be the greater consequence of those spiritual realities of sin and separation. When we think about the work of Jesus over these next 3 weeks, when we think about what he'll experience in the final weeks of his life, what he'll teach, what he'll do, let's keep in mind that it all starts out with Jesus's passion, his compassion, his care for the human reality, his care for people's sense of being leaderless, directionless sheep without a shepherd, his care for people's physical suffering, his care for people's physical needs like uh, food to eat, his care for their ability to see life for what it really is. And because Jesus cared, we now have a person who can serve as our shepherd, our guide through life. We have a person to whom we can take our suffering. We have a divine resource that we can petition for our physical needs. And we have someone who can show us what life is really all about. Over these next few weeks, let's lean in to Jesus' caring for us in all of these areas. And let's remember also that as the church, we are the embodiment of Jesus in the world. And if Jesus cared about people being like sheep without a shepherd, if Jesus cared for people's physical suffering, if Jesus cared about people's physical needs, if Jesus cared about helping people see life for what it really is, we as a church need to care and do something about those things as well. We have an incredible Savior in the person of Jesus. We have a person who can free us from so much of our suffering, dilemma, and predicament in this life. And the work of Jesus, which will culminate in his resurrection on Easter Sunday morning, begins with Jesus' compassion and caring. Because Jesus cared, and because Jesus cares, we have, in the words of the hymn writer, an all sufficient Savior.